Hi there, Dan Scott here. I want to show you how I painted the mist in one of my recent landscapes. This is the reference photo I painted from. I took this on a painting trip in the Noosa hinterlands. A key feature of this subject is the mist and the overall sense of atmosphere, particularly this area where you can see the trees gradually fade into the mist. This was surprisingly tricky to paint. I had to trial and error a few different approaches until I found what worked. I'll walk you through each of these approaches, even though some of them didn't work, as I want to give you an honest look into my painting process. I started by broadly mapping out the shapes and colours. First, the dark trees at the back. These trees really anchor the painting and provide a bit of structure for all the light greys and greens. I didn't do much at this stage of the painting. I was just focused on getting the value right and making sure the area was dark enough. But I did start to suggest a bit of the gradation where the trees are fading into the mist. Then I blocked in the sky with a cool and light grey. This needs to be the lightest area in the painting, but it also needs to appear a bit grey and overcast, so it needs to be light but not too light. I worked this colour into the trees to create a soft edge. Because this is such a misty and overcast landscape, soft edges played a very strong role in this painting. Finally, I mapped out the green foreground. This is how I start many of my paintings. I like to get all the big colour shapes in place before moving on to the smaller details, as this allows me to make more informed and accurate decisions. If I don't have all the major colour shapes in place, it can be difficult to judge the colours. That's because colour is relative and the appearance of a colour can change based on the surrounding colours. This is even more evident when dealing with subtle things like mist and overcast skies. My judgment of colours needed to be on point with this painting, otherwise I would have easily made a mess of it. I spent a bit of time refining these shapes and adding the dark trees on the right-hand side. And this left me in a position to finally get to work on the misty trees at the back. It may seem that for a video about painting mist, I haven't really done much of that yet, but that's just how painting goes. You often need to set the stage first and paint the surroundings before you can approach the main part, and the surroundings are just as important. I laid down some rich magenta and cobalt blue to suggest the trees. I was departing from the reference photo a bit here, as I figured the purples and blues would give the painting an interesting glow. It's always worth remembering that the reference photo is just there as a guide, and to remind yourself of your first impressions of the subject. It's not something you need to copy pixel by pixel. I used a brush to apply the colours, and then I worked them into the surface with my finger. The idea was to pick up that nice gradation from relatively strong and dark colours at the front to weak and light colours at the back. I wanted it to appear like trees are gradually melting into the misty atmosphere. But the trees also need to appear as trees, with all the different colours, forms and textures, so I couldn't smooth it out too much. After applying the magenta and cobalt blue, I went back to applying a few cool greens and working these colours together. I was trying to pick up those distinct jumps in space where the trees suddenly change in colour. You can see what I mean here in the reference photo. By adding more green, I was able to pull the trees forward in perspective. The painting still wasn't reading that well for me at this stage, so I swapped to a palette knife and explored some different strokes and textures. It was a case of I knew what I wanted the painting to look like, but I just wasn't sure how to get there. That's why I kept going back and forth with all these different approaches. I then moved on to other parts of the painting to give me a break from the mist. If an area is proving to be tricky in a painting, I try not to work on it for too long. I prefer to jump around and keep my mind fresh. I often find that the solution to the problem will come to me as I'm working on the other areas. That's kind of what happened with this painting. I realized that the colors at the back were too dark and I needed to lighten this whole area up a bit. So I went over it all with some light grey sky color. The lighter colors will play much better into the idea of the misty atmosphere and the overcast sky, with everything being illuminated by a soft, cool light. Again, I used a brush to apply the paint, then I used my finger to work it into the surface and blend it in with the surroundings. I find that my finger is particularly helpful for subtle subjects like this, where I need to get a good feel and touch for what's going on. I then went over the sky with a lighter color. This gave it more of the soft white glow I was looking for. It was easy to change the color around the top of the sky. I simply added more titanium white to the mix and scumbled this over the top. It's not pure white, even though it looks that way in the context of the painting. It's still a very light and slightly cool grey. I had to be more intentional with my brushwork for the parts of the sky showing through gaps in the trees. I also used less paint on my brush to make my strokes weaker and more subtle. I went back to a palette knife to rough things up a bit and to make the trees look more like trees, rather than this vague, soft shape. I like jumping between the brush and palette knife like this, as you can take advantage of their different strengths and characteristics. In this case, I used my brush and finger for applying the colors and blending them together, and I used the palette knife to inject a bit of energy and texture and to break up the edges a bit. As I worked with the palette knife, some of my strokes were adding more paint to the surface, and some strokes were scraping it away. Being able to easily scrape away paint from the surface is handy for subtle subjects like this, as it allows me to keep the paint fairly thin and manageable. The more paint you have on the surface, the harder it is to control. The last thing I did for the misty trees was add a few strokes of pale blue with a small round brush. I liked the appearance of the rich colors I added earlier, and I wanted to push a bit more in that direction. So I very gently scumbled these colors over the top without compromising what was already on the surface. That was pretty much it for the mist. Here's how the painting turned out. One of the key takeaways from this video is that painting is rarely a linear process. You'll often need to tinker and experiment with different approaches as you work your way through to the finish. This should also give you an idea of just how much work goes into even simple subjects like this. All up, this painting took a bit under 4 hours to complete. Thanks so much for watching. Please give the video a like and follow the channel if you found it helpful. I'll see you in the next one.